The auction was over in 4 minutes. That was how long it took for everything Margaret Calloway had ever known to change hands. For minutes of men in dusty hats calling out numbers in the dry heat of a Tombstone afternoon, while she stood on the steps of the county courthouse with her wrists bound in front of her and her chin at an angle that communicated, to anyone paying attention, that she had not yet decided to be defeated. Most of them were not paying attention. They were looking at the debt ledger that Sheriff Briggs was holding, which listed the specific amounts owed by the late Samuel Calloway to 4 separate creditors, and calculating whether the land and its contents would cover the sum. The land itself was not being auctioned. The land had already been taken. What was being auctioned was the labor contract. 3 years of work assigned to whoever paid the highest amount against the debt, after which the remainder would be forgiven and Margaret Calloway would be free to go wherever she chose, with whatever she had accumulated in 3 years of contracted labor, which everyone present understood would be very little. This was legal in Arizona territory in 1883. It should not have been, but it was, and the people who had made it legal were the same people who benefited from it remaining so. Margaret was 32 years old. She had brown hair that was coming loose from its pins because she had not been given time this morning to attend to it properly, and she had gray eyes that were currently doing what gray eyes do when their owner is furious and has decided that showing the fury openly would give someone else a satisfaction she was not prepared to provide. She had been a schoolteacher in Tombstone for 6 years. Before that she had been the daughter of a miner in Colorado who had died owing more than he owned, which was a pattern she was now discovering had repeated itself in her marriage. Samuel Calloway had been a good man in most respects and a catastrophically careless one in others, and the carelessness had produced, at his death 3 months ago, a debt so large and a set of creditors so impatient that the territorial labor provision had been invoked before she had finished grieving. She had consulted a lawyer. The lawyer had told her the provision was legal. She had asked if there was anything to be done. He had said not quickly enough to matter. She stood on the courthouse steps and listened to the numbers go up and thought about what 3 years of her life was worth in the mathematics of men who had decided they had the right to assign a number to it. The bidding stopped at a figure she did not write down because she did not want to know it. The man who had said it was standing at the back of the gathered creditors and onlookers, leaning against a post with his arms folded, wearing a coat that had seen considerable use and a hat that had seen more. He was perhaps 38 years old, tall, with the kind of face that had been weathered into its final form by sun and wind and time spent outdoors. He had dark eyes and a jaw that suggested opinions held firmly, and he had been standing at the back since before the proceedings started, not speaking to anyone, watching with an expression that gave nothing away. Sheriff Briggs confirmed the bid. He said the man's name, Daniel Rourke. The name meant something to the people present. Margaret could tell that by the way the gathered men shifted, some of them looking at each other with expressions she could not fully read. Not fear exactly, more like the specific acknowledgement of a fact that has implications. Briggs walked the contract to the back of the crowd. Margaret watched Rourke take it. He read it. He folded it and put it in his coat pocket. He looked up, and his eyes found her on the courthouse steps with the directness of someone who has already decided something and is confirming it. He walked toward her. She held his gaze. She had decided, at some point in the past 4 minutes, that looking away was not something she was willing to do. He stopped 2 feet from her. He looked at her for a moment, with those dark eyes that were not unkind but were not performing kindness either. They were simply looking with the same quality of attention he had brought to the contract. "My name is Daniel Rourke," he said. "I own the Rourke cattle operation 12 miles north of here." "I know who you are," she said. Her voice was steady. She had made it steady through an act of will she intended to maintain indefinitely. He looked at her bound wrists. He reached into his coat pocket and produced a folding knife. He cut the rope without ceremony or comment, the way a man cuts something that should not have been there in the first place. She looked at her wrists. Then she looked at him. "You are mine now," he said. He said it quietly and without the satisfaction that the words might have carried in someone else's mouth. He said it the way you state a legal fact. Then he said, "That is what the contract says, and I intend to honor the contract, and I also intend to tell you right now what that means and does not mean so that we understand each other from the beginning." She waited. "It means you work for me for 3 years and the debt is cleared," he said. "It means you will be paid a fair wage above the debt service, which is not required by the contract but which I am telling you now will happen regardless. It means you will have your own quarters, your own time outside of working hours, and you will not be asked to do anything that is not honest work. He held her gaze. It does not mean anything else. If anyone on my property or anywhere else suggests otherwise, you tell me and I will handle it. She looked at him for a long moment. Why, she said. He considered the question with the seriousness it deserved. Because what is happening on these courthouse steps is wrong, he said, and I could not stop it happening, but I could determine what happens after it. He paused. And because I need someone who can read and write and keep accounts, and you are apparently the best teacher in Tombstone, which suggests you can do both. She looked at him steadily. You came here specifically for me, she said. I came here specifically to make sure it was not someone else, he said. She thought about this. About the 4 minutes. About 3 years. About the knife that had cut the rope without ceremony. She picked up the bag at her feet, which contained everything she had been permitted to keep. Then, she said, I suppose we should get started. The ride to the Rourke cattle operation took 2 hours through country that changed as they moved north, the flat, dusty outskirts of Tombstone giving way to rising land and the particular dry beauty of the Arizona high desert in the late afternoon. He had given her a horse. Not a borrowed horse or a spare horse, but a good one. A steady bay mare with sound feet and a sensible disposition, and she rode it with the ease of someone who had grown up on horseback in Colorado before teaching had made her mostly stationary. He noticed this. She noticed that he noticed and said nothing about it, which she thought was the correct approach for a man who had just told her he intended to be straightforward. They did not speak much on the ride. There was something she needed to understand before she spoke, and what she needed to understand was what kind of man Daniel Rourke was, which was not something a man told you about himself but was something you assembled from the evidence of how he moved through the world and what he paid attention to and what he did not bother with. What she assembled in 2 hours of riding beside him was this. He was a man who looked at the land the way people look at something they are responsible for. Not possessively, responsibly. When they passed a section of fence that needed attention, he noted it with the automatic recognition of someone cataloging work without resentment of it. When a hawk crossed the sky ahead of them, he watched it for a moment with an expression that was not quite pleasure but was something adjacent to it. The expression of a man who notices the things around him rather than moving through them without seeing. He had said he needed someone who could read and write and keep accounts. She suspected this was true and also that it was not the whole truth, but she had decided to leave the rest of it where he had left it, which was unsaid, and let it become clearer on its own terms. The ranch came into view as they crested a low rise. It was a working operation clearly and completely, not a place that had been built to impress but a place that had been built to function. A main house, solid and well-maintained. Several outbuildings in good repair. Corrals with horses that moved with the easy quality of animals that have been handled correctly. A bunkhouse from which smoke was rising, which meant supper was being prepared, which meant it was later than she had realized. A man came out of the barn as they rode in. He was perhaps 55, with a gray beard and the permanent squint of someone who has spent decades looking at things in bright sun. He looked at Margaret with the frank assessment of someone who has been told something and is comparing the information to the reality. This is Hector, Rourke said. He has been running the day-to-day operations here for 11 years. Hector, Margaret said. Ma'am, Hector said. He said it with the careful neutrality of a man who has decided to form no opinions until he has more information. She recognized this. She had been a schoolteacher for 6 years. She knew what it looked like when someone was reserving judgment, and she knew that the correct response to it was to give them something worth judging. She looked at the ranch yard. She looked at the main house. She looked at the corrals and the barn and the outbuildings with the same systematic attention she had brought to the ride. Then she looked at Rourke. Where are the accounts kept, she said. He looked at her for a moment. Then he said, inside. I will show you. Hector watched them walk toward the main house with an expression that had shifted, very slightly, from careful neutrality toward something that might eventually become something else. The accounts were a problem. Margaret sat at the desk in the main house that evening, after supper, with 3 years of ledgers in front of her and a lamp that Rourke had positioned without being asked at the angle that provided the best light for reading, and she went through the books with the focused systematic attention of someone who is not yet alarmed but is paying close attention to the things that might eventually become alarming. The operation was profitable. That was clear from the first ledger and confirmed by the second. Rourke ran a tight and intelligent cattle operation, and he understood land and livestock with the depth of someone who has been paying attention for a long time. The income was consistent and the core expenses were reasonable. The problem was in a category of expenditure that appeared in the second year's ledger and increased steadily through the third. It was labeled simply as territorial fees, and the amounts were large enough and regular enough that they were beginning to affect the profitability of the operation in ways that the income growth had not yet caught up with. Territorial fees was not a category that legitimate ranch operations generally carried at this scale. She sat with this for a moment. She was a woman who had learned, from the specific experience of being married to a man who did not tell her the full truth of his financial situation, that the things not in the ledger were sometimes more important than the things in it. But she had also learned not to reach conclusions before she had sufficient evidence, because conclusions reached too early tended to survive evidence that should have changed them. She closed the second ledger and opened the third. The territorial fees had increased again. She heard footsteps and looked up. Rourke was in the doorway of the study, holding a cup that he extended toward her without comment. Coffee. She took it. You have found the fees, he said. It was not a question. Yes, she said. He came into the study and sat in the chair across from the desk. He looked at the open ledger and then at her. What do you want to know, he said. Everything, she said. He told her. The territorial fees were payments to a man named Colton Walsh, who held a position in the Territorial Land Administration Office that gave him authority over grazing permits, water rights, and the annual certification that ranching operations in the district were in compliance with territorial regulations. Walsh had, over the previous 3 years, developed a practice of identifying technical deficiencies in compliance documentation and offering to resolve them administratively in exchange for payments that were not recorded in any official account. It was extortion. It was conducted through the machinery of the Territorial Administration, which made it legal in the sense that the machinery existed and was being used, and illegal in the sense that the use of it for personal financial extraction was a crime that Walsh was confident no rancher would formally report, because the reporting would require challenging a territorial official whose goodwill was necessary for the operation of the ranch. He was right that most ranchers would not report it. He had been right about Rourke as well for 3 years. Margaret listened to all of this without interrupting. When he finished, she was quiet for a moment, looking at the ledger. How many other ranches is he doing this to, she said. He looked at her. As many as he can, he said. I have spoken to 2 other operators who confirmed it. There are probably more who have not confirmed it because they do not trust that confirming it will not make things worse. She thought about this. She thought about the courthouse steps and the 4 minutes and the territorial provision that was legal because the people who benefited from it had made it legal. She thought about what it meant that the same territory that had allowed her debt to be auctioned was also the territory that employed Walsh. How much has he taken in 3 years, she asked. Rourke told her the number. She looked at the ledger. That is recoverable, she said, if the practice is stopped and the overpayments are documented. He looked at her. You think it can be stopped, he said. I think, she said, that corrupt officials are only safe when the people they are stealing from believe they have no options. She met his eyes. Do you have the original compliance documentation? All of it. From before the fees began. It is in the filing cabinet, he said. Behind you. She turned and looked at the filing cabinet. Then she looked at the ledger again. I am going to need a few days, she said. He looked at her for a moment with the same quality of attention he had brought to everything since the courthouse steps. Take what you need, he said. Now I want to ask you something. Have you ever been in a situation where someone assumed you had no options, and you decided to find one anyway? Not loudly, not dramatically, just quietly and systematically finding the thing that they had assumed was not there. Tell me in the comments, because that is exactly what Margaret Calloway was doing at that desk, and I want to know if you recognize it. She worked for 5 days. She went through every piece of compliance documentation in the filing cabinet, which went back to the founding of the operation and was organized with the same methodical care that the rest of the ranch demonstrated. She cross-referenced it against the territorial regulations, which Rourke had a copy of in the study, and against the specific deficiencies that Walsh had cited in his demands. On the third day she found what she had suspected she would find. Walsh's cited deficiencies were not deficiencies. They were technical interpretations of ambiguous regulatory language, interpreted in the most unfavorable possible reading, and they were interpretations that a formal regulatory review would not sustain. Walsh had been betting that no one would request a formal review, because requesting a formal review meant going to the Territorial Administration Office, which Walsh was part of. But the Territorial Administration Office was not the only authority with jurisdiction. She read the Territorial Charter carefully that evening twice. The Charter established a board of review that existed independently of the Administration Office, appointed by the governor, with the specific mandate of investigating complaints about the conduct of territorial officials. It had been established precisely because the framers of the Charter had understood that an administration office with no external oversight was an invitation to the kind of conduct Walsh had been practicing for 3 years. The board met quarterly. The next meeting was in 6 weeks. She wrote a letter to the board that night. She wrote it the way she wrote everything, clearly and in sequence, with specific citations to the relevant regulations and specific documentation of the specific instances in which Walsh had applied those regulations in a manner inconsistent with their plain meaning. She attached copies of the original compliance documentation, organized by year and by the specific deficiency Walsh had cited, with a brief analysis of each that showed why the citation did not hold under a correct reading of the regulation. It was a teacher's document. It was organized the way you organized an explanation for someone who needed to understand something they had not understood before, building from the established facts to the specific conclusion, leaving nothing assumed. She read it back. She changed 3 words. Then she set it aside and went to find Rourke. He was on the porch. It was late, past 10, and the sky was the particular deep black of a desert night with more stars in it than seemed possible. He was sitting in a chair with a cup that was probably not coffee at this hour, looking at the dark shape of the mountains to the north. She sat in the other chair. "I have written a letter to the Territorial Board of Review," she said. He looked at her. She told him about the board. She told him about the charter provision. She told him about the letter and what it contained and what she expected it might produce if the board received it and acted on it, which was not guaranteed but was possible. And possible was enough to try. He was quiet for a long moment. "You found this in 6 days," he said. "I found it in 3, she said. "I spent the other 2 making sure I was right." He looked at her with an expression she had not seen on him before. Not surprise exactly. More like the expression of a man who had prepared himself for a certain kind of situation and is discovering that the situation is a different kind. "Will they act on it?" he said. "I do not know," she said honestly, "but Walsh has been operating on the assumption that no one will formally document what he is doing and present it to an authority with the power to act on it. That assumption is now incorrect. Whether or not the board acts, his risk calculation has changed." He was quiet again. "You came to this ranch 3 weeks ago with 1 bag," he said, "and in that time you have reorganized the filing system, identified a 3-year extortion scheme, researched the relevant territorial charter, and written a formal complaint to the Board of Review." 6 days, she said. "The filing system took the first week." He looked at her. Then he said, with the directness of a man who has decided that something needs to be said and is saying it, "I told you on the courthouse steps what the contract meant and did not mean. I told you everything I could tell you at the time honestly." She waited. "I did not tell you," he said, "that I had been watching what Briggs and the creditors were doing to you for 2 weeks before the auction and had been trying to find a legal way to stop it and had not found one." He paused. "I did not tell you that I went to the auction because stopping it entirely was not possible, but determining what happened to you after it was." He met her eyes steadily. "I should have told you that at the courthouse. I did not because I did not want you to feel obligated," she said. "Yes," he said. She looked at him for a moment. Then she said, "I have been in situations before where a man made a decision about my life without telling me the full truth of it." She held his gaze. "You should know that I do not respond well to that, regardless of the intention behind it." "I know," he said. "I am telling you now." She was quiet for a moment. "Why did you bid?" she said. "The real reason. Not the accounts." He looked at the mountains. He was the kind of man who looked at things in the distance when he was deciding how honest to be, and she had begun to recognize this as the tell of a man who was going to be honest. Because you were standing on those courthouse steps with your hands bound and your chin up, he said, and you were furious and you were not going to show it. And I thought that a woman who could hold herself like that in that situation was someone I did not want to see handed to any of the men who were bidding. He paused. That is the real reason. The accounts needed attention, but that is not why I went to the auction. She looked at him for a long time. She thought about the 4 minutes. She thought about the knife that had cut the rope. She thought about the lamp positioned at the right angle without being asked, and the horse that was a good one, and the words "it does not mean anything else," said plainly and without performance on courthouse steps in front of everyone. She thought about a man who had spent 2 weeks trying to find a legal way to stop something and had not found one and had gone to the auction anyway to do what he could with what was available. She thought these things were worth something. She was also not going to say so yet because she had learned to be careful with the things worth something, and careful meant taking the time to be sure. I appreciate you telling me, she said. He nodded once. They sat on the porch in the desert night with the stars overhead and the mountains dark to the north, and neither of them said anything further, and the silence was not uncomfortable. The letter to the Board of Review was sent on a Monday morning. Margaret made 2 copies. She sent one to the board and one to a newspaper editor in Tucson named Arthur Reeves, whom she had identified through a conversation with Hector, who had been in Arizona Territory for 30 years and knew the landscape of it in more than the geographical sense. She sent it to Reeves not because she expected him to print it immediately but because she understood that a formal complaint with no public dimension existed entirely within the system it was complaining about, and that a public dimension, even a potential one, changed the calculation of everyone involved. Hector, when she had explained her reasoning for the newspaper letter, had looked at her for a long moment and then said, "The school in Tombstone did not know what it had." She said, "It knew. It simply could not afford to keep it, which is a different problem." He had almost smiled at this. She thought that Hector's almost smiles were a form of significant approval, and she was collecting them the way you collect evidence of something you want to be sure of before you name it. Rourke had read both letters before she sent them. He had read them with the focused attention he brought to things that mattered, and he had said, when he finished, "These are the best organized documents I have seen produced in this territory." She had said, "They needed to be." He had said, "Yes." And then he had said, after a pause, "You should know that if this does not work, I will not hold it against you. The situation is not of your making." She had looked at him. She had said, "If this does not work, I will find another approach." She paused. "I did not come this far to stop at the first obstacle." He had looked at her with the expression she had been cataloging for 3 weeks, which was the expression of a man who had been expecting a certain kind of situation and kept encountering a different kind and was in the process of deciding what to do with the difference. The Board of Review responded in 4 weeks, which was faster than Margaret had expected, and which she took as an indication that her letter had landed on people who were already aware of Walsh and had been waiting for documentation sufficient to act on. The response was formal and specific. It acknowledged receipt of the complaint. It requested additional documentation of 3 specific points, which she had anticipated and had prepared already. It indicated that the matter would be placed on the agenda of the next quarterly meeting, which was in 2 weeks rather than the 6 she had originally calculated, because an emergency session had been called on related matters. Related matters. She read this phrase twice. It suggested that Walsh's activities had come to the board's attention through more than one channel, which meant that other ranchers had found the courage to document what was happening, possibly after hearing that someone else had done it first. She prepared the additional documentation and sent it within 24 hours. She also wrote a follow-up letter to Arthur Reeves in Tucson, who had responded to her first letter with a brief note indicating that the matters described were consistent with information he had received from other sources and that he intended to look into them further. She gave him the name of one of the other ranchers Rourke had mentioned, with that rancher's permission, which she had obtained through Rourke, who had ridden out to speak with the man himself on a Wednesday when she had asked him to. She had not asked Rourke to do this. She had said that it would be useful to have the other rancher's account on the record, and Rourke had looked at her and said he would go that afternoon. This was becoming a pattern between them. She identified what was needed. He understood immediately and moved toward it. She had not worked with anyone this way before and found it both efficient and slightly unnerving, in the specific way of something that is unfamiliar but not unwelcome. The Board of Review convened its emergency session on a Thursday morning in Tucson. Margaret and Rourke arrived the evening before and took rooms at the hotel. At dinner, in the hotel dining room, she organized the documentation one final time, and he watched her do it with the quality of attention that she had stopped trying to ignore because ignoring it had proven more effort than simply acknowledging it to herself. They had been living in the same house for 6 weeks. They had been working alongside each other for 6 weeks with the particular intensity of people who are engaged in something that requires genuine collaboration, and genuine collaboration over 6 weeks produces a knowledge of a person that cannot be manufactured any faster regardless of the circumstances. She knew that he drank his coffee without anything in it, and that he read at night for an hour before he could sleep, and that he was unfailingly patient with the horses and occasionally less patient with the paperwork that the operation required, not because he was careless with it, but because his mind worked better outdoors than indoors, and he had never found a way to reconcile this with the administrative reality of running a large operation. She knew that he had been alone for a long time and that the aloneness had not made him smaller, which she had found was not always the case, and that he had the particular quality of someone who had thought about things carefully and arrived at positions he could defend, which she respected even when she did not entirely share them. He knew things about her too. She was aware of this. He knew that she was methodical to a degree that sometimes frustrated people who worked less carefully. He knew that she had a dry humor that appeared in unexpected moments and disappeared before most people had registered it. He knew that she had not cried once in the 6 weeks she had been at the ranch, which was not because she had nothing to cry about but because she had decided, at some point she could not precisely identify, that crying in front of people she was still learning to trust was a form of vulnerability she was not yet ready to offer. She thought he probably understood this without her having to explain it, which was itself a form of being known that she was not accustomed to. At dinner she said, "Tomorrow they will hear the formal complaint and the documentation. The Walsh situation will either be resolved in the territory's interest or it will not be, and if it is not we will pursue other options." She looked at her coffee cup. "But I believe it will be resolved correctly. The documentation is sufficient. The board has independent jurisdiction, and Reeves has published a preliminary article in the Tucson paper this morning that makes this a public matter, which changes the political calculation considerably." He looked at her across the dinner table. "You arranged the article," he said. "I provided Reeves with sufficient information at sufficient intervals to allow him to publish responsibly," she said. "The article is his, based on his own investigation of the matters described." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Margaret." She looked at him. He said, "When the contract period ends. 3 years from now." He stopped. He was looking at her with those dark eyes that were not unkind and had never been anything other than direct. He started again. "I am asking this now rather than then because waiting until then seemed like a form of dishonesty, given what I know and what I suspect you know." She held his gaze. "What are you asking?" she said. He said, "When the 3 years are done and the contract is fulfilled and you are free to go wherever you choose, I would like you to stay. Not because of the accounts, though the accounts have not been as good without you for 11 years as they have been in 6 weeks with you." He paused. "Because I have found that I am considerably more interested in the next 30 years than I was before you arrived on this ranch, which is a significant development for a man who was managing his solitude as a permanent condition." She looked at him for a long moment. She thought about the courthouse steps and the 4 minutes and the rope cut without ceremony. She thought about the lamp at the right angle and the good horse and the door opened without being asked to the full records of an operation that most men would have considered private. She thought about 2 weeks of trying to find a legal way to stop something, and a bid made at the back of a crowd, and the words "I intend to honor the contract and also tell you right now what it means and does not mean." She thought about a man who looked at land the way people look at something they are responsible for rather than something they own, and who watched a hawk cross the sky with an expression that noticed it, and who had said, "I should have told you that" at the courthouse with the directness of someone who understood that honesty delayed was a form of dishonesty. She said, "I am going to tell you something that I have not told anyone since Thomas died, which is that I am tired of managing alone." She held his gaze. "I am very good at it. I have demonstrated that repeatedly. But being good at a thing is not the same as preferring it." He looked at her steadily. She said, "I am also going to tell you that I do not intend to wait 3 years to answer your question. Because waiting 3 years when the answer is already clear seemed like the form of dishonesty you were trying to avoid." He was very still. "The answer is yes," she said. If you mean what I think you mean, he said, I mean exactly what you think I mean. She looked at him across the dinner table in the hotel in Tucson, with the Board of Review meeting in the morning and Walsh's account books in the document case beside her chair, and she thought that the particular arithmetic of her life had produced, through a set of circumstances she would not have designed and would not have chosen and could not now imagine being without, exactly the thing she had stopped believing was available to her. The Board of Review found against Walsh on 7 of the 9 cited violations. The 2 that were not sustained were minor and procedural, and both sides understood that their omission from the finding was a technicality that did not affect the substance of the outcome. Walsh was removed from his position. The overpayments made by the 5 ranching operations he had been targeting were formally documented and a restitution process was established, though Margaret had not entered the complaint with restitution as her primary goal and received the news of it as a useful addition rather than a necessary outcome. Reeves published a full account of the board's finding in the Tucson paper, which was picked up by papers in Phoenix and Prescott. The coverage was factual and specific. Margaret read it and thought that Reeves had used his sources well and had not overstated the case, which was what she had hoped for when she first wrote to him. The territorial governor, who had not been involved in Walsh's conduct and who had an interest in demonstrating this publicly, issued a statement commending the board's action and announcing a review of compliance oversight procedures across the territory. None of this undid the courthouse steps. None of it gave her back the 3 months between Samuel's death and the auction. None of it changed the fact that the legal mechanism that had put her on those steps still existed. But it was something. It was the specific something that was available, and she had learned to work with what was available rather than waiting for what was not. Now I want to stop here and ask you this. Have you ever taken the long way to something that turned out to be worth the distance? The route that went through the difficult thing instead of around it, and delivered you somewhere you could not have gotten any other way? Tell me in the comments. Because Margaret Calloway took the long way, and I want to know if you recognize the road. They were married in the spring. Not with ceremony, because neither of them was a person who required ceremony for things to be real, but with the substance of a decision made by 2 people who had looked at each other clearly over 6 months of close quarters and hard work and the particular intimacy of shared purpose and had arrived at the same conclusion through different routes. The Reverend from the nearest town came on a Tuesday and performed the service in the front room of the main house with Hector as witness, who stood through the proceeding with the expression of a man who has been watching something develop for 6 months and finds its conclusion both inevitable and satisfying. Afterward, Hector shook Rourke's hand and said, with 11 years of working for him compressed into 4 words, "About time." Then he went back to work. Margaret stood on the porch of the house that was now also hers in a way that the contract had never made it, and she looked at the ranch yard and the corrals and the country beyond, which she had been learning for 6 months and which she thought she might spend 30 years continuing to learn and still find new things in. Rourke came and stood beside her. She said, "The East water allocation needs to be renegotiated before summer. I have been looking at the Territorial Water Board records and there is a better arrangement available that the previous holder of our permit did not pursue." He looked at her. "We have been married for approximately 40 minutes, he said. "The water allocation does not know that," she said. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "You are going to be an extremely inconvenient person to be married to." She looked at him. There was the dry humor appearing in her face, which he had learned to watch for because it came and went quickly if you were not paying attention. "You had 6 months to determine that," she said. "I gave you adequate time." He looked at her for a moment. Then he did something she had not seen him do before, which was smile fully and without reservation, and it changed his face in a way that she thought she would continue to find interesting for a considerable time. "I had 6 months, he said. "I reached a conclusion." "Yes," she said. "You did." She looked at the country to the north, which was good country, and which was worth what it had cost to get here, and which she intended to understand better every year for as long as she was in it. Rourke put his hand over hers on the porch rail. She turned her hand and held his, which was something she had decided she was going to do without making a production of it, because the things worth having generally did not require a production. The water allocation was successfully renegotiated in July, which resulted in a 17% improvement in the summer grazing capacity of the North pasture. Margaret documented this in the ranch records under improvements, which was the category she had created when she reorganized the filing system in her first week and which had been filling steadily ever since. The territorial labor provision that had put her on the courthouse steps was challenged in the territorial legislature 2 years later by a coalition of women's organizations and 2 sympathetic legislators, with supporting documentation that included a formal account of the circumstances of its application that Margaret had written at the request of the coalition and which was read into the legislative record. The provision was not repealed in that session. It was repealed in the following one, in 1886, which was 3 years after the auction and 2 years after it had ceased to be relevant to her own circumstances and remained entirely relevant to her interest in its elimination. She was in the gallery when the repeal passed. Rourke was beside her. She did not cry because she was not a person who cried in public, but she sat very still for a moment after the vote was recorded, and he put his hand over hers in the gallery of the territorial legislature the way he had put it over hers on the porch rail on their wedding day, and she held it, and that was enough. There is a letter in the Arizona Historical Society archive, written in 1921 by a woman named Margaret Rourke. It was written in response to a request from a historian who was documenting the history of territorial labor law in Arizona and who had found her name in the legislative record. He asked her to describe what had happened on the courthouse steps in 1883. She wrote, "I stood on those steps for 4 minutes while men called out numbers for something that should not have had a number. I was 32 years old and I had done nothing wrong, and I was furious about it in the specific way of someone who understands that the fury is correct and that showing it will not help and who has therefore decided to keep it inside and use it for fuel instead. A man cut the rope on my wrists and told me plainly what the contract meant and did not mean. I got on a horse and rode 12 miles into country I had not seen and sat down at a desk that evening and began to understand what I was dealing with. I want to be precise about something that historians sometimes miss. The courthouse steps were not the end of the story. They were not even the worst part of the story, though they were the most visible part. The worst part was the assumption behind them, which was that a woman in debt had no options worth considering. That assumption was wrong. I spent the better part of a year demonstrating that it was wrong, with documentation and correspondence and a formal complaint to a board of review, and the demonstration required the assumption to have been made in the first place. I am not grateful for the courthouse steps. I am not required to be grateful for injustice because it led somewhere better. But I will say this, which is the truest thing I know about that period of my life. The situation I was put in, which was designed to limit what was available to me, turned out to contain more options than the people who designed it had anticipated. It always does. That is the thing they never account for. The assumption that a person has no options is always, in the end, wrong. It is only a question of how long it takes to find them. The man who cut the rope is still here. He has been here for 38 years. He was right on the courthouse steps about what the contract meant and did not mean, and he has been right about most things since, and on the occasions when he has been wrong he has said so without requiring it to be a significant event, which I have found to be one of the most useful qualities in a person over the long term. We have been married for 38 years. The water allocation is still working correctly. The north pasture is the best grazing land in the county. The filing system has been reorganized twice since 1883, once by me and once by our daughter, who has her father's eyes and my approach to paperwork, which her father considers a mixed outcome and I consider entirely satisfactory. And that is the whole story. A courthouse in Tombstone. For minutes. A debt that was not hers. A rope cut without ceremony. A desk with 3 years of ledgers and a lamp at the right angle. A letter to a board of review written by a woman who had been told she had no options and had decided to find some anyway. If you were Margaret, would you have stayed or walked away after 3 years?